So I'm already seeing people attacking Eddie Hearn for allowing this Conor Benn, Chris Eubank Jr. fight to happen. People are saying that he's doing the same thing that he did with Kell Brook when he stepped up 2 weight classes and fought Gennady Golovkin. They didn't like it then, and they don't like it now, I guess from a moral perspective. Well, I never had an issue with Eddie Hearn promoting Kell Brook versus Golovkin, and I have no issue with Eddie Hearn promoting Conor Benn versus Eubank Jr. And I'll tell you why. Boxing, ever since its inception under the Queensberry rules, the modern incarnation of pugilism, has always had unscrupulous individuals operating within it. Managers, promoters, matchmakers, gangsters, various other types of criminals, shady lawyers, etc., etc. And even still to this day, and even more so in decades gone by, boxers were exploited. There were fighters who were barely literate, coming out of the ghettos in places like America, who were taken advantage of by promoters. Some of them were owned, literally owned, by the mob and other criminal organizations. They had no idea what amount of money they should be getting paid. These are people that worked menial jobs as farmhands, as laborers in factories and on building sites, who were paid cash in hand. So to them, boxing was another cash in hand job. They didn't understand how much money was being brought in by the gate and how much money was going in the pocket. They didn't know, or many of them anyway, didn't know any of this. And they just accepted the situation for what it was. Boxers were kept in the dark financially for many years. And I'm sure in many parts of the world that still goes on. So I fully acknowledge all the exploitation there's been, this horrendous exploitation of boxers who, again, didn't know any better, uneducated, illiterate, and all this kind of thing. But in the case of Kell Brook fighting Gennady Golovkin, that wasn't so. Kell Brook wasn't some naive kid who just turned over professional and he was being forced to fight this guy, or you won't get paid for the last fight. You know, we're going to withhold all of your money until you do all these fights that we tell you that you have to do. As far as I'm aware, at least, that wasn't happening with Kell Brook. And this narrative that Eddie Hearn basically wouldn't give Brook any top opportunities, and he almost forced him into the Golovkin fight because he knew that that was the most lucrative for him, as in for Eddie Hearn. Absolute nonsense. Kell Brook was offered the Jesse Vargas unification fight. He turned it down. The reason he turned it down is he felt he wasn't getting enough money. Jesse Vargas apparently was getting the lion's share. And the reason he was getting the lion's share is because that was his requirement, that was his demand for fighting Brook in the UK. It's difficult to get a lot of these Americans to fly over to the United Kingdom when they're champions because they're thinking about judges and this and that and the other. So with Jesse Vargas, he demanded an enormous amount of money, by far the lion's share as I understand it. I remember watching interviews where Eddie Hearn said that Brook wasn't happy about the split. But in boxing, it isn't great. It doesn't feel great from an ego perspective. And you might feel like you're getting done over financially. But sometimes you have to make sacrifices. Sometimes you have to take the short end of the stick in this fight in order to get the lion's share in the next fight. And I know hindsight is always 20/20, but especially when I look back retrospectively, I would have picked Kell Brook over Jesse Vargas. Again, you look at their careers and the way their careers have panned out. I can't remember how I was thinking at the time about the fight, but looking back now retrospectively, how many of you guys would have picked Brook over Vargas if they'd fought prime for prime? I would have picked Brook, looking back retrospectively. So there was an opportunity there for Brook to beat Vargas, become unified champion, and then all of a sudden, there's pressure on Keith Thurman and whoever else was champion at the time. There's pressure on them to unify with Kell Brook. And even if Brook was to go over to the United States, he'd be paid more money this time than the first unification with Vargas. You see what I'm saying? He already gained a certain amount of credibility beating Sean Porter in the States. If he was to then have another American go over to the UK and relieve him of his title as well, even more credibility from American people. As long as that win over Vargas, if it were to have happened, was a decisive win. So he could have gone down that road. He said, no, I want to get paid big money now. I don't want to get paid big money in the next fight. I want to get paid, as in the fight after next, should I say. I want to get paid big money in this fight. So Brook was impatient about wanting to be paid big money. Yeah, he'd been looking for a big fight for a long time. It hadn't materialized. He'd been defended against the Frankie Gavins and Joe Jordans of the world. But eventually, an opportunity came to unify with Vargas. He turned it down. He wanted big money, so he went for it against Gennady Golovkin. And it was partly inspired by watching his rival Amir Khan fight Canelo Alvarez. Because when Khan got the Canelo fight, Brook, by his own admission, turned around to Eddie Hearn and said, "Get me Golovkin." So it's almost like it was one-upmanship with Amir Khan. That's part of the reason that he took the Golovkin fight. So this was something that was already suggested by Brook to Eddie Hearn. And what you guys are saying is that Eddie Hearn should have turned around to Brook and said, "No, I will never make the fight. You're not going to fight. I'm going to stop you from fighting." And I know Eddie Hearn sometimes acts like he cares so much morally about, he has this moral compass where he cares so much about the fighters and he won't let them do this and he won't let them do that from a moral standpoint. I mean, I don't buy any of that. I think Eddie Hearn is a clever businessman and he'll use the moral angle when it's convenient to do so. I think that with the Kell Brook situation, obviously Eddie Hearn wanted to save the show. So Kell Brook had already suggested fighting Golovkin. He went back to Kell Brook and said, "You still want to fight him? Because this is the money," which was far more money than Kell Brook was used to getting. And Brook said yes. So I don't have an issue with it. At the end of the day, Brook at that stage was an experienced campaigner. Not just experienced in the ring, but experienced in business. His stepdad was there, to oversee things and understand his stepdad is somebody who actually cares for him on a personal level outside of the boxing. So he had people around him who could step in and say no. But ultimately, he is his own man. Ultimately, he's not a little boy. He makes his own decisions. You see it. So Brook wasn't forced into fighting Golovkin. He chose to do it. That's why I never had an issue with it. Same situation here with Conor Benn taking on Eubank Jr. And I should have also mentioned the fact that had Kell Brook not asked Eddie Hearn to make the Golovkin fight in the first place several months prior, then maybe Eddie Hearn wouldn't have even offered the fight to him at the time. Maybe he would have thought that might have raised Brook's eyebrows in the sense that, wow, my promoter wants to put me in with this killer 2 weight divisions above. What's wrong with this guy? Do you know what I mean? So, that possibly might have been the case as well. But I feel the same regarding this fight with Conor Benn and Eubank Jr. Conor Benn's team are seemingly happy to take the fight, as in his manager, his trainer. His dad, to my knowledge, hasn't said anything negative about it. He hasn't come out and said, no, my son can't do this. I'm not aware of his dad saying anything like that. So if the rest of his team are all cool with it and his dad's apparently cool with it, then why should the blame, right, for this risk that Conor Benn is taking? And of course it is a risk. Why should this blame all fall at the feet of Eddie Hearn? Eddie Hearn's just there putting it all together, providing the opportunity. He's not forcing Conor Benn to do anything. Now, I said a long time ago that Conor Benn has been very, very well managed in his career up to date. I actually said this, and I was saying it in videos before I heard Eddie Hearn saying it. Because Eddie Hearn started saying it, I want to say a fight or two after I was saying it. Maybe it's just because it's obvious, or maybe, has Eddie Hearn been watching my videos again? I don't know. But very well managed from my perspective, in the sense that they've given him the right fights at the right time, not only to build his commercial profile, or to raise his profile and his commercial value, but also, and most importantly, to develop him as a fighter, to develop his ability as a fighter. They've given him the right fights at the right time in order to bring that about until this moment, because this is a deviation from what they were doing. You see, if he were to continue on the path that he was on with regards to these incremental steps of, upping the level of opposition gradually, slowly but surely, right? If he was to continue on that path, then the next step would probably be to fight, let's say, a Danny Garcia, a Keith Thurman, and if not someone on that level, if not someone of that stature, then perhaps even a fight which is very easy to make, Conor Benn versus Michael McKinson. I was actually saying that in my Element group during the Ortiz-McKinson fight. I was, in fact, before the opening bell, I was saying, depending on how this goes, I reckon Conor Benn's people might look to match him against McKinson next. Because it makes sense. If you look at the trajectory of Conor Benn's career, the way they've been gradually stepping him up each time, McKinson would make sense. Because his last couple of opponents were, has Van Heerden ever challenged for a world title? I know he fought Spence, but that was before Spence was a champion, right? Has he fought? I'm not sure, but certainly Chris Algieri is a former world champion, and he's fought for world titles and what have you. But those guys were old. McKinson's a guy who just fought for a world title and he's young. You have to imagine he's in his prime or close to his prime. And I was saying before the fight, if this guy manages to go the distance with Ortiz or, go a long way in the fight and gives a good account of himself, it makes sense that they would put Conor Benn in with McKinson next because McKinson, one, is a matchroom fighter. So it's a win-win for Eddie Hearn, no matter who gets the victory. And two, well, he's not a puncher, so he's not going to knock Conor Benn out. Three, Conor Benn gets to try and go on better than Virgil Ortiz, stop him earlier. You see what I'm saying? He has something to shoot for. So to me, that would have been a fight which was in keeping with the trajectory that Conor Benn's career was already on. This Eubank Jr. fight is a deviation from that. It's a strange fight. It's a bizarre fight. I was watching an interview with George Groves, and he was saying that this is a bizarre fight. It really is bizarre because of that deviation. And as I said in my video talking about the announcement of the fight, there's no reason for this to happen other than the family, I say family rivalry, the rivalry between their dads and the interest that that's going to generate with the public out of nostalgia. Because if these two guys didn't have, if there wasn't this rivalry between their dads, then these two guys wouldn't be fighting. They wouldn't be looking at each other as potential opponents in all likelihood. And if you had made the fight when their dads didn't have a rivalry, people really would call you crazy. Be like, what are you having this welterweight jump up and fight a middleweight for, a middleweight contender? Like, what's that all about? He doesn't need to. There's people that he can fight at 147 to bring him on. There were people saying that Eddie Hearn can't find Conor Benn a big fight or a big opportunity. Well, he hasn't been able to get him the Thurman fight, although Thurman did respond recently to Conor Benn's call out. Also, the Danny Garcia fight. Eddie Hearn hasn't been able to get those, but I don't necessarily think he needs to get those. As I say, McKinson would be a decent next step. It's like Jerome Ennis. Has Jerome Ennis been able to get Danny Garcia or Keith Thurman in the ring? No. Has Virgil Ortiz been able to get Danny Garcia or Keith Thurman in the ring? No, he hasn't. So Conor Benn isn't in a much different position to Ortiz or Ennis in terms of the people who are willing to fight him. So I think people are being kind of unnecessarily harsh on the job that Eddie Hearn's doing. For the longest time, the welterweight division has been controlled by Al Heyman and PBC. And it still is for the most part because Errol Spence is a PBC guy. Danny Garcia is a PBC guy. Porter's retired, but he was a PBC guy. Keith Thurman's a PBC guy. Terrence Crawford is a free agent. We don't know. He might do a short deal with PBC. We'll see how that goes. The only people that are not with PBC, Jerome Ennis apparently isn't with PBC, but he fights on PBC shows. The only people that have no PBC association at all in terms of either contenders or champions, to my knowledge anyway, maybe there's somebody I'm forgetting, but the only people out of the main contenders, let me just say that, out of the high-profile contenders and the champions, the only people that have no association with PBC are Conor Benn and Virgil Ortiz. Benn being with Matchroom and Virgil Ortiz being with Golden Boy, you see? So it's not so easy to just get a crack at one of the champions. If you want to fight other contenders, that can happen. Yeah, as I've already mentioned, Conor Benn can fight McKinson, no problem at all. So long story short, I have no issue with the fight, even though it's bizarre. And of course, it's a risk for Conor Benn. It's a risk for Eubank Jr. too, if it happens at a catch weight, particularly if there's a rehydration clause. It's a risk all round. But boxing is a risky sport. You can only do but so much. Maybe we should ban certain things. Maybe we should ban rehydration clauses. I got no issue with catch weight fights, but rehydration clauses, maybe that's a step too far. Boxing is unlike any other sport, not just in terms of the sport itself, because you do find similar sports, of course, MMA, kickboxing, and so on, bare knuckle. But in terms of the business, boxing is very unique. Boxing is like the Wild West from a business perspective. There isn't the structure, there isn't the rhyme and reason in boxing business that you'd find in MMA, right? And I personally like that. I'm someone who gets bored of things easily in terms of the same old routine. I'm someone that likes a switch up, a change up. I've always been a nomadic person, for example. I like moving around to different countries and having different, seeing different things and different environments and whatever. So that's the kind of person I am. And that's what I like to see in boxing. I like to see random stuff sometimes, weird stuff. You know what I mean? Wacky and bizarre and unexpected stuff, because it keeps it fresh and interesting to me. And boxing is the sport for that. They've always had these catchweight fights and these strange things going on. And at the time we might frown and think, well, what's that all about? But oftentimes in retrospect, you look back and think, that was actually really interesting. That was actually really entertaining. Not always, but on many occasions you do. I mean, Roy Jones Jr. stepped up several weight divisions to fight John Ruiz. He stepped up from light heavyweight to heavyweight. Roy Jones was a small light heavyweight, 175 pounds, and he was weighing under 175 for many of his light heavyweight fights. He stepped up to fight John Ruiz, who was a heavyweight over 220 pounds. In the ring, there was a big weight difference, and in terms of natural weight, an even bigger difference. Should the matchmakers, should the promoters not have put that on? Was it morally wrong to put it on? Now, obviously, you're talking about a very ordinary heavyweight champion versus one of the greatest fighters of all time. Okay, so the skill gap was huge. And so the question was, can this enormous skill gap compensate for the size gap? With Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr., you could argue that the skill gap is nowhere near as wide between the two of them. In fact, some might say that there's a similar level of skill between the pair of them. I would say Conor Benn is more skilled, but again, people could argue it. This is a bit different to Kell Brooks stepping up and facing Golovkin, because Golovkin was a killer at middleweight. Chris Eubank Jr. is not a killer. So I don't think the ability gap is particularly wide between the two. I should say the power gap. That's what I really meant to talk about rather than the ability gap. I don't think the power gap is as big between these two. I think there's a power gap there, but I don't think it's as big between these two as it was between Golovkin and Brook. I think the power that Golovkin was able to hit Brook with was unlike anything he'd experienced in a professional fight. I don't think Conor Benn is in for that much of a shock when Chris Eubank hits him. You see what I'm saying? So in that sense, I don't think it's as dangerous in that way as it was for Kell Brooks stepping up. And also, I think Conor Benn, when he wants to be, is more of an elusive target than Brook. Brook relies on his physical strength and his power and his very solid jab to keep you off. Yeah, he does have a certain amount of upper body movement, but it's relatively minimal. He really relies on, that fast, powerful jab, keeping you honest with that. Conor Benn is much more of a ducker and a diver. He's way more fluid than Brook and moves his upper body, and just like his dad, when you're attacking him, he can make himself difficult, very difficult to hit. So it's going to be interesting, I think, to see how Eubank Jr. approaches that puzzle when Conor Benn's moving his head all over the place. Because this is unlike any other head movement that Eubank Jr. will have dealt with before in his career. Now, it should go without saying that for Eddie Hearn, of course, this is all about money. This is not about what's best for Conor Benn in terms of his career development, because he was on that path and he's completely deviated from it here. You could say that every cloud has a silver lining, and we have to wait and see how this Eubank Jr. fight pans out in the ring. Maybe there'll be some valuable learning experiences for Conor Benn here. And if Conor Benn wins, then Eddie Hearn's going to look like a genius. And people will say that it was a master stroke. But going into the fight, why do you think Eddie Hearn has decided to do this? Do you genuinely think that the stuff he's saying about believing that Conor Benn is going to win is true? Personally, I don't think Eddie Hearn is as confident in a Conor Benn win as he's making out. That's my personal suspicion. We can't go in Eddie Hearn's brain and read his thoughts, but that's my suspicion. I think that Eddie is looking after himself at this point, and that's why he's putting this fight on again. He hasn't forced Conor Benn into it, but that's why he likes the idea of it. I think that Eddie is feeling the pressure from his bosses at DAZN. They want him to deliver. They've, as in Len Blavatnik, the owner of Access Industries and ultimately DAZN, had to inject something like $4.2 billion into the company recently. So they obviously are going to be putting pressure on the people lower down the totem pole, and that includes Eddie Hearn. So he's under pressure to deliver. They missed out on the AJ fight, as in AJ Usyk 2. So this right here, as I said in the previous video, is perhaps somewhat of a consolation prize for them. That's why they're putting it straight on pay-per-view. How can you, in any other scenario, justify pay-per-view for a fight between two guys who are not even world champions on a platform which was supposed to, in the words of Eddie Hearn and various others, kill pay-per-view? And at this juncture, what exactly is the point of DAZN? What's the selling point? Because, again, previously, it was all about killing pay-per-view. Only the mega fights, the AJs would go on pay-per-view. And prior to that, even AJ wasn't supposed to go on pay-per-view. But as the business model that DAZN came up with has, or decided to go with, should I say, because they didn't invent that business model. But as that business model has come under increasing stress because of the financial state of the economy and what have you, they've deviated more and more from their original mission statement. And therefore, the people who work for them, like Eddie Hearn, are deviating more and more from what they were previously doing. He had Conor Benn on the perfect or near perfect trajectory in terms of developing him as a fighter. So that is what that is. But look, as I've said several times already, Eddie Hearn's just doing what Eddie Hearn does. He's a businessman. He's making his money. He's not forcing Conor Benn into anything. I'm sure if Conor Benn and his team wanted to go in a different direction and fight somebody else, somebody more appropriate, somebody in the 147-pound division, I don't think Eddie Hearn would have an issue with it. So ultimately, the buck stops with Conor Benn, with his manager, with his trainer, with his family. His dad, Nigel, was a professional fighter. He knows the ropes. He knows what it's all about. And of course, Conor himself, he's an adult. He can make his own decisions. So that's the way I feel about it all. And from the perspective of Eubank Jr., well, there's this catch weight issue. We don't know what a catch weight's going to be. We're assuming there is one. We're also unsure, at least at the time of making this video, I'm unsure about whether there's going to be a rehydration clause. And again, those are things that Eubank, his dad, his team, his promoter, Callis Sauerland, they have to consider in terms of the safety of Eubank Jr. But ultimately, again, the buck stops with Eubank Jr. himself. So he is the one that ultimately decides what risks he wants to take, because you're weighing up the risk versus the reward. You decide as an individual whether you want to go there. Both of these guys are doing that. Both of these guys have decided of their own free will that they do want to go there. It is what it is. I'm not so upset that there are people who want to facilitate this. At the end of the day, it isn't the most outrageous thing I've ever seen in the boxing ring, right? Seeing a guy like Eubank Jr., who's a middleweight contender. He's never been an elite middleweight. He's never proven himself to be elite. He's always just been kind of a contender. And then you've got a welterweight contender. As I've already described, it's quite different to the Brook Golovkin situation because, again, you could say that Conor Benn hasn't proved as much as Brook. He hasn't proven himself to be as formidable as Brook. But Eubank Jr. hasn't proven himself to be as formidable as Triple G. Not even close. Do you know what I mean? Like, for my money, based upon what I've seen, Conor Benn is closer to the ability of Brook than Eubank Jr. is to the ability of Golovkin at the time when Golovkin fought Brook. In the sense that Golovkin was a machine. He was a killer. He was somebody who everybody in the division was frightened of. Or most people in the division were frightened of. That's not the case. And he was a destructive puncher. It's not the case with Eubank Jr. So yeah, where it's a risk for Conor Benn, it's not, at least my perception of it, is it's not as much of a danger. It's not as hazardous in my head to his health as a Brook stepping in there against the Golovkin, or even an Amir Khan stepping in against Canelo Alvarez. Nevertheless, the bookies do have Eubank Jr. as a favorite, as far as I'm aware, and I think that's a reasonable situation. I think he should be the favorite. He's the bigger man, and he tends to feast on pressure fighters. Anyway, that's my take on the fight. I wanted to say a bit more about all of these critics coming at Eddie Hearn. And look, I criticize Eddie Hearn plenty. If you're new to the channel and you're maybe getting the wrong impression here, thinking that I'm some type of Eddie Hearn defender and Eddie Hearn fanboy, nothing could be further from the truth. Over the past few months, I've been constantly accused of being an Eddie Hearn hater. What I do here is objective analysis. Analysis of fights, analysis of boxing politics, etc., etc. And an analysis of fighters and their ability. I try and be as objective as I possibly can, which means that I'm going to criticize everybody at some point, including your favorite fighter or your favorite promoter, etc. So yeah, just wanted to say that. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below about all the points I've raised in this video, about the attacks on Eddie Hearn, the fight itself, and everything else. Let me know, people. If you're tired of the biased narratives and mass censorship on mainstream platforms, and you want to be part of a community of critical thinkers who love free speech just as much as you do, then come and join me on Patreon and access my weekly no-holds-barred, censorship-free podcast where we lift the lid on a wide variety of controversial topics. It's not mainstream friendly, it's not politically correct, but that's the whole point. We dare to stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Hot Topics. You'll gain access to a minimum of 2 hours of exclusive content every single week, including podcasts, videos, interviews, live stream Q&As, as well as my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Not to mention a vast back catalog of hundreds of hours of previous episodes. You can listen via the Patreon app with the option to download in high quality MP3. We've also got an Element group where you can come and chat and hang out with myself and other members. Unlike Discord, it has full end-to-end encryption, is decentralized, and is 100% censorship free. You can also send voice notes as well as much larger audio and video files than you can on Discord. So come and sign up on Patreon. There's no contract, there's no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a cup of coffee. So I'll see you over there. I'm out.